The dust swirled around Eleanor Evans' skirts as she stood at the edge of her family's property, tears streaming down her face while her father's voice still echoed in her ears. "You choose him. You're no daughter of mine." The year was 1875, and in the small town of Randsburg, California, the Evans family name carried weight that now crushed Eleanor's heart as she watched her father's retreating form, knowing she had just lost everything for the sake of a love her family deemed unworthy. Eleanor wiped her tears with trembling hands, startling when she heard the familiar sound of hoofbeats approaching from the west. Jackson Archer rode toward her, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the setting sun, his worn hat pulled low over concerned eyes. The moment he saw her standing alone with nothing but a small valise, he understood what had happened. "They've cast you out," he said, his voice quiet as he dismounted, dust rising around his weathered boots. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak through her grief. At 22, she had never imagined being without her family, despite their controlling ways. "They said I had to choose. I chose you, Jackson." Jackson's weathered face, bronzed from years under the California sun, softened as he reached for her hand. At 28, he'd seen his share of hardship, working as a ranch hand and occasional cattle driver, earning a reputation as reliable but never wealthy enough for the Evans family's approval. "I told you this might happen, Ellie," he said gently, using the name only he was permitted to call her. "I know," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "But I love you. I won't apologize for that." Jackson looked at her standing there, Eleanor Evans, the daughter of the most influential merchant in Randsburg, with her chestnut hair and determination burning in those hazel eyes. She had chosen him over everything she'd ever known. He nodded once, decision made. "Wait here." Eleanor watched as he rode back toward town, confusion mingling with her heartbreak. Had she been wrong? Would he leave her too? 30 minutes later, Jackson returned, his horse now bearing saddlebags that hadn't been there before. He dismounted again, standing before her with resolution etched into every line of his sun-weathered face. "I packed what we'll need to start with," he said simply, gesturing to the bulging leather saddlebags. "Food, blankets, a bit of money I'd saved." He took a breath, then looked directly into her eyes. "We'll go together." "Go where?" Eleanor asked, hope beginning to replace despair. "North to the mining country. My cousin has land near Sacramento, says there's work for men willing to do it, and no one cares about your family name." He took her hands in his calloused ones. "It won't be easy, Ellie, nothing like what you're used to." Eleanor looked back at the town of Randsburg, at the life she was leaving behind, the comfort, the security, the family that had just disowned her for daring to love a man they considered beneath them. "Nothing worth having comes easy," she said, turning back to him. "I chose you, Jackson Archer. I choose this life, our life, whatever it brings." A rare smile broke across his face as he helped her mount his horse, settling her before him. The warmth of his chest against her back gave Eleanor courage as they set off northward, leaving behind the only home she had ever known. They traveled until nightfall, making camp beneath a canopy of stars that seemed brighter than Eleanor had ever seen them. Jackson built a small fire, and as he prepared a simple meal of beans and dried beef, Eleanor watched him with newfound eyes. This was the man her family had deemed unworthy, a man who worked with his hands, who knew how to survive, who had offered her his heart without reservation. "You're staring," he said, not looking up from the fire. "I'm wondering why I didn't run away with you months ago," she replied honestly. Jackson looked up then, his expression serious. "Because you're not the type to run, Eleanor Evans. You stand your ground and fight. It's one of the reasons I fell in love with you." That night, lying beside the fire with Jackson's coat draped over her for warmth, Eleanor realized that while she had lost her family, she had gained something far more precious: freedom to choose her own path with a man who saw her true worth. The journey north was harder than Eleanor had imagined. Her soft hands blistered from handling the reins when Jackson let her ride alone. Her back ached from sleeping on the hard ground. But each day brought new discoveries, the taste of fresh caught fish cooked over an open flame, the majesty of a mountain pass at sunrise, the quiet intimacy of conversations under the stars. By the third day, they reached a small settlement where Jackson traded some of his possessions for supplies they would need. Eleanor noticed the curious glances from townspeople, the whispers behind hands. A well-dressed young woman traveling with a cowboy raised eyebrows even in the relatively free-spirited West. "They think I've run off with you," she whispered to Jackson as they left the general store. "Haven't you?" he replied with a hint of a smile. "Yes," she said, lifting her chin. "And I'd do it again." That night, as they made camp near a small stream, Jackson seemed unusually quiet. Eleanor, who had been washing their few dishes in the stream, returned to find him staring into the fire, turning something over in his hand. "What is it?" she asked, settling beside him. He opened his palm to reveal a simple gold band. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "She gave it to me before she died, said to give it to the woman who would stand by me when times got hard." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I know we can't have a proper wedding, not yet. But I want you to have this, to know that I intend to marry you proper as soon as we're settled." Eleanor felt tears well in her eyes as she took the ring. "My father said you couldn't provide for me," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "but he was wrong. You've given me the only thing I ever truly wanted, the chance to choose my own happiness." Jackson slipped the ring onto her finger, and though it was slightly loose, to Eleanor it felt like it belonged there. That night, beneath the vast California sky, they sealed their promise to one another with a kiss that tasted of hope and new beginnings. The next morning brought rain, a steady, soaking downpour that slowed their progress to a crawl. By midday, Eleanor was drenched to the skin, her teeth chattering despite Jackson's coat draped over her shoulders. When they spotted a ramshackle barn in the distance, Jackson made the decision to seek shelter. The barn belonged to a widow named Martha Collins, who eyed them suspiciously when they appeared at her door asking permission to wait out the storm. "You two married?" she asked bluntly, looking from Eleanor's fine, if now bedraggled, clothes to Jackson's worn attire. Eleanor opened her mouth to explain, but Jackson spoke first. "Yes, madam, just heading north to my cousin's place near Sacramento." The lie was necessary, they both knew. A single woman traveling alone with a man would find few doors open to her. Martha's weathered face softened slightly, and she gestured them inside. "Got soup on the stove. Might as well come in and dry yourselves." That night, sleeping in Martha's spare room on a real bed for the first time in days, Eleanor whispered to Jackson, "We're going to have to make that lie true, you know, as soon as possible." In the darkness, she felt rather than saw his smile. "Yes, madam," he echoed his words to Martha, and Eleanor felt a flutter of anticipation in her chest. The storm lasted 2 days, during which Martha proved to be a gruff but kind hostess. She put them to work, Jackson repairing her leaking roof, Eleanor helping with cooking and mending. On the evening before they planned to depart, Martha sat at her kitchen table watching Eleanor stitch a torn shirt. "Your hands weren't always like that," she observed, noting the blisters and calluses forming on Eleanor's once smooth skin. Eleanor looked up, surprised. "No, they weren't." "Rich family," Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "In Randsburg, they didn't approve of Jackson," Martha snorted. "Parents rarely do. Mine didn't like my Henry either, said a blacksmith wouldn't amount to much." Her eyes grew distant. "We had 30 good years before the fever took him. Never regretted a day." When they left the next morning, Martha pressed a small package into Eleanor's hands. "Wedding present," she said gruffly. "Every woman needs her own." Later, Eleanor unwrapped the package to find a beautiful bone-handled knife. "For protection," read Martha's note. "And for carving out the life you want." The remainder of their journey passed without major incident, though Eleanor found herself growing stronger each day. She learned to help make camp, to recognize edible plants, to start a fire when Jackson was hunting for their dinner. By the time they reached the outskirts of Sacramento territory, she hardly recognized herself, sunburned, leaner, and infinitely more capable. Jackson's cousin Daniel lived on a modest homestead about 20 miles east of Sacramento. As they crested the final hill and saw the small cabin with smoke rising from its chimney, Jackson reached for Eleanor's hand. "Ready for this?" he asked. She squeezed his hand in response. "As long as we're together." Daniel Archer proved to be a younger version of Jackson's same strong jaw, same quiet manner, though with a more ready smile. He welcomed them without question, offering what hospitality his bachelor home afforded. "Town's got a preacher comes through every other Sunday," Daniel mentioned that evening over a supper of venison stew, "if you're looking to make things official." Jackson glanced at Eleanor, who nodded. "We'd be much obliged," he said. 2 weeks later, under a canopy of California oaks, Eleanor Evans became Eleanor Archer. Her wedding dress was simple, a blue calico purchased from the general store with money Jackson had earned helping Daniel build a new corral. Her bouquet was wildflowers gathered that morning. But as she spoke her vows to Jackson, with only Daniel and a few neighbors as witnesses, Eleanor felt richer than she ever had in her father's home. The preacher, a kindly older man named Reverend Thomas, signed their marriage certificate with a flourish. "Not many love matches I see out here," he commented. "Mostly practical arrangements. You too, though." He smiled at them. "You've got something special." That night, in the small cabin Daniel had helped them build on the edge of his property, Jackson and Eleanor began their life together as husband and wife. Their wedding night was tender, filled with whispered promises and the sweet discovery of each other that comes with true love and commitment. "I never thought I could be this happy," Eleanor whispered as they lay together in the darkness, the sounds of the night surrounding their little cabin. Jackson traced her face with gentle fingers. "You deserve every happiness, Mrs. Archer," he said, the new name making her smile. "Say it again," she requested. "Mrs. Archer," he obliged, pulling her closer. "My wife." The first year of their marriage brought challenges neither had anticipated. The land was harder to work than expected, with rocky soil that broke tools and tested Jackson's patience. Winter came early and harsh, forcing them to huddle together for warmth in their small cabin when supplies ran low. Eleanor learned to stretch meals when game was scarce, to mend clothes until they could barely hold another stitch, to wake before dawn to help with chores before beginning her own work. But even in the hardest times, she never regretted her choice. Spring brought new hope and unexpected news. Eleanor missed her monthly courses, and by April, she was certain they would have a child come winter. Jackson received the news with stunned silence, followed by a joy so profound it brought tears to his eyes. That night, he knelt beside her as she sat by the fire, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "A woman who loves me, a child of my own. I swear to you, Ellie, I'll make sure you never want for anything." Eleanor covered his hand with hers. "We already have everything that matters." As her pregnancy progressed, Eleanor found herself thinking more of the family she'd left behind. Her mother, who had stood silent as her father cast her out. Her younger sisters, Mary and Catherine, who had cried as she walked away. Even her stern father, whose principles had proven more important to him than his daughter's happiness. One evening, as autumn painted the surrounding hills in gold and crimson, Eleanor sat writing a letter by lamplight. "What are you doing?" Jackson asked, coming in from his evening chores. "Writing to my family," she replied without looking up. "They should know they'll have a grandchild soon." Jackson frowned. "After what they did, I'm not doing it for them," Eleanor interrupted gently. "I'm doing it for me. For our child. Family is too precious to throw away even when they're wrong." She looked up at him. "Wouldn't you want to know if you were them?" Jackson couldn't argue with that. The letter was sent the next day with no certainty it would receive a response. The baby came during the first heavy snow of winter, a boy with Jackson's dark hair and Eleanor's hazel eyes. They named him William Daniel Archer, after both their fathers, though Jackson only spoke his own father's name with reluctance. "He left when I was 10, he explained as they watched their newborn sleep. Never knew what happened to him. Then our William will know a different kind of father, Eleanor said with certainty. Their son was 3 weeks old when a knock came at their door during a bitter December evening. Jackson opened it, his hand instinctively moving to the gun he kept nearby, only to freeze in shock at the sight of the man standing in the snow. William Evans, Eleanor's father, stood rigidly on their doorstep, his expensive coat dusted with snow, his face older than Jackson remembered. "Mr. Archer," he said stiffly, "I received my daughter's letter." Jackson hesitated only briefly before stepping aside. "Come in, sir. It's no night to be standing in the cold." Eleanor looked up from where she sat nursing the baby, her face paling at the sight of her father. For a long moment no one spoke, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the soft noises of the nursing infant. William Evans removed his hat, his eyes fixed on his daughter and grandchild. "Eleanor," he said finally, his voice rough. "Father," she replied, her tone carefully neutral. "You've come a long way. Your mother wouldn't let me rest until I saw for myself that you were well." He glanced around their modest cabin, the simple furniture, the carefully mended curtains, the signs of a life built with love rather than money. "Are you?" he asked. "Well." Eleanor looked down at her son, then up at Jackson, who had moved to stand protectively beside her chair. "I am happier than I ever thought possible," she said with quiet dignity. Something in her father's face changed, a softening around the eyes, perhaps, or a slight lowering of his proud shoulders. "The boy," he said, nodding toward the infant. "What's his name?" "William," Jackson answered. "William Daniel Archer." Eleanor saw the surprise flash across her father's face, followed by something that might have been emotion. "May I?" He began, then stopped as if unsure of his welcome. "Would you like to hold your grandson?" Eleanor asked gently. The moment William Evans took the small bundle in his arms, something changed. His stern face softened as he looked down at the child who bore his name. "He has your eyes," he said quietly to Eleanor, "and Jackson's spirit," she replied. "He's strong, already fighting to hold his head up." Her father stayed 3 days, sleeping on a pallet by the fire, asking careful questions about their life, watching Jackson with assessing eyes as he worked from dawn until dusk to provide for his family. On the morning of his departure, he handed Jackson an envelope. "This belongs to Eleanor," he said. "Her mother's inheritance. I was wrong to withhold it." Jackson started to refuse, his pride bristling, but Eleanor laid a hand on his arm. "Thank you, Father," she said, accepting the envelope, "not for the money but for coming. For seeing our life as it truly is, not as you feared it would be." William Evans nodded once, then surprised them both by extending his hand to Jackson. "You've proven me wrong, Archer," he said gruffly. "My daughter chose better than I knew." After he left, Eleanor opened the envelope to find a substantial bank draft and a note in her mother's handwriting. "For my grandson's future, and as an apology for our absence from your life. Your sisters and I will visit in the spring, with or without your father's blessing. Love endures, even when pride gets in the way." Eleanor read the note aloud to Jackson, who listened with mixed emotions. "Does this change anything?" he asked. "Do you regret the hard times now?" She shook her head firmly. "The money will make things easier, yes. But I needed to know I could survive without it, that we could build something real together." She cradled their son against her chest. "The hardship showed me who I truly am, Jackson, who we are together. I wouldn't trade that knowledge for all my father's gold." Spring brought new growth to their land and visitors to their door. Eleanor's mother and sisters arrived in April, bringing trunks filled with gifts for the baby and tearful embraces for Eleanor. The reunion was sweet, healing wounds Eleanor hadn't fully acknowledged. "I should have stood up to your father," her mother admitted as they sat watching William play with his blanket. "I was wrong to let you go without a fight." "You're here now," Eleanor said simply. "That's what matters." To everyone's surprise, Jackson and Eleanor's mother developed an easy rapport. She appreciated his quiet strength and obvious devotion to her daughter, while he respected her gentle wisdom and the courage it had taken to make this journey against her husband's wishes. "He's coming around, Mrs. Evans confided to Eleanor before they left. "Your father may be stubborn, but he misses you, and he can't stop talking about his grandson to anyone who will listen." As their second year of marriage began, Eleanor and Jackson used part of her inheritance to purchase additional land adjoining Daniel's property. They built a larger home, though still modest by Evans' standards, and began raising horses alongside their small herd of cattle. Word spread about the quality of Archer horses, and by the time William was walking, their business had begun to prosper. Jackson hired 2 hands to help with the expanding operation, while Eleanor kept the books and began selling her preserves and baked goods in town. "You don't need to work so hard," Jackson told her one evening as she finished tallying the month's earnings. "We have enough now." Eleanor smiled up at him. "I'm not doing it because we need the money, I'm doing it because I enjoy it." She patted her stomach, where the beginnings of another life were just starting to show. "Besides, I want our children to see that both their parents built this life." Their daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Archer, was born on a clear summer night in 1878, with her grandmother Evans in attendance. Unlike her brother's difficult birth, Sarah came into the world quickly and with little fuss, a trait that would define her personality in the years to come. "She has your determination," Jackson observed as he watched Eleanor nurse their daughter. "Heaven help us all." Life settled into a rhythm of seasons and milestones. William's first words, Sarah's first steps, the expansion of their home to include a proper kitchen where Eleanor experimented with recipes that became sought after throughout the county. In the autumn of 1879, a letter arrived bearing news that changed their lives once more. William Evans had suffered an apoplectic fit and, while recovered, was no longer able to manage his business affairs. He requested Jackson and Eleanor's return to Randsburg, if only temporarily, to help settle matters. "We don't have to go," Jackson said, watching Eleanor's face as she read the letter. "Yes, we do," she replied without hesitation. "He's my father. And it's time to go home, not as the girl who was cast out, but as the woman who made her own way." The journey back to Randsburg was vastly different from their departure. They traveled by train rather than horseback, with 2 small children and a confidence born of success and security. When they arrived, the town seemed smaller somehow, less imposing than in Eleanor's memory. William Evans received them in the parlor of the home where Eleanor had grown up. He sat in a wheeled chair, his right side weakened by his illness, but his eyes were alert as they took in his grandchildren, 3-year-old William clutching his father's hand. 1-year-old Sarah perched confidently on her mother's hip. "You've done well," he said to Jackson, his speech slightly slurred but understandable. "We both have," Jackson replied, his arm going around Eleanor's waist. During their 3-month stay in Randsburg, healing continued. Old neighbors who had once whispered about Eleanor's disgrace now invited her to tea, eager to hear stories of her life in Sacramento. Young men who had once dismissed Jackson as a penniless cowboy now sought his advice on horses and cattle. Most importantly, the rift between Eleanor and her father continued to mend. William Evans watched his son-in-law manage his business affairs with intelligence and integrity, saw how the townspeople had come to respect the man he had once considered beneath notice. "I was wrong about him," he admitted to Eleanor one evening as they sat on the porch watching Jackson teach little William to whittle a stick. "About both of you. We forgave you long ago, Father," Eleanor replied. "The question is whether you've forgiven yourself." Before they returned to their home, William Evans signed over half his business interests to Jackson and Eleanor. "Not as charity," he insisted when Jackson began to protest. "As an investment in capable hands. You'll make it worth more than I could now." So it was that the Archers began dividing their time between their ranch near Sacramento and the Evans Mercantile in Randsburg, building a bridge between the worlds that had once seemed impossibly far apart. In the spring of 1880, they added a wing to their ranch house to accommodate Eleanor's parents, who came to stay during the harshest winter months when William's health was most vulnerable. Who would have thought it? Eleanor mused to Jackson one evening as they watched their children play with their grandfather on the porch. 5 years ago, he cast me out for loving you. Now he can't bear to be apart from us. Jackson pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. Love changes people, Ellie. It changed me. Before you, I never thought I deserved more than a hired hand's life. And now, he gestured to their home, their land, their growing family. Now I know that a man makes his own worth, and I'm worth exactly what you saw in me all those years ago. By 1885, 10 years after Eleanor had stood in the dust watching her father turn his back on her, the Archers had become one of the most respected families in both Randsburg and Sacramento County. Their horse breeding operation had expanded significantly, with Archer horses in demand throughout California and beyond. They had added a third child to their family, James William Archer, born in 1882, with his father's quiet manner and his mother's quick mind. Their home had grown accordingly, though Eleanor insisted on maintaining its warm, welcoming atmosphere rather than adopting the cold grandeur of her childhood home. On the anniversary of the day, Jackson had packed his saddlebags and said those life-changing words, "We'll go." Eleanor always prepared a special meal, recreating the simple beans and beef they had shared on their first night away from Randsburg. Why do we eat this every year? 8-year-old William complained, poking at his beans. We can afford better now. Eleanor exchanged a smile with Jackson across the table. To remember where we started, she explained, and how far we've come. After the children were in bed, Jackson and Eleanor often sat on the porch of their home, watching the stars that had guided them on their journey north all those years ago. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't chosen me that day? Jackson asked on one such evening, his hand warm around hers. Eleanor considered the question seriously. I might have had an easier life, she admitted. More comfort, less work. Jackson nodded, accepting this truth without offense. But, she continued, turning to face him fully, I would never have known what I was capable of. I would never have discovered my own strength or the joy of building something with my own 2 hands. She raised those hands, now work-worn and capable, so different from the soft, sheltered ones she'd had when they met. Most importantly, I would never have known how it feels to be truly loved for exactly who I am. Jackson drew her close, his kiss as tender as it had been on their wedding day. Thank you for choosing me, he whispered against her hair. Every single day. I would choose you again, she replied with certainty, 1,000 times over. In the years that followed, the Archer family weathered storms both literal and figurative. They endured drought years when the land seemed determined to defeat them. They supported Daniel through the loss of his wife in childbirth, helping raise his daughter as one of their own. They mourned with Eleanor's mother when William Evans finally succumbed to another, more severe stroke in 1887. Through it all, their love remained the foundation upon which everything else was built, a love forged in adversity, tested by hardship, and ultimately triumphant. By 1895, 20 years after they had left Randsburg together, Jackson and Eleanor had created a legacy neither could have imagined. William, now 20, had graduated from the university in Sacramento and returned to help manage their expanding business interests. Sarah, at 18, showed her mother's entrepreneurial spirit, having already established a small but thriving millinery business in town. 13-year-old James was showing remarkable talent with horses, seeming to understand the animals in a way that even his father found impressive. On a warm summer evening, as they hosted a gathering to celebrate their 20th wedding anniversary, Jackson pulled Eleanor away from their guests for a private moment on the porch where they had shared so many conversations. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his pocket to produce a small velvet box. Eleanor opened it to find a ring far more elaborate than the simple band he had given her beside a campfire so many years ago, a diamond surrounded by smaller stones that caught the light of the setting sun. "Jackson," she breathed, "it's beautiful, but you love your mother's ring," he finished for her. "I know, this isn't to replace it." He took the new ring and, to her surprise, slipped it onto her right hand rather than suggesting she remove the original from her left. "This is for the woman you've become, the woman who built a life from nothing but love and determination. Who never wavered, even when the path was hardest." Eleanor felt tears fill her eyes as she looked at the two rings, one simple, one elaborate, both representing different facets of their journey together. "I never needed diamonds," she said softly, "just you. And I never needed anything but your love," he replied. "Everything else, this home, our business, our beautiful children, those are gifts I never dreamed I'd have." From the garden came the sounds of laughter as their children and friends celebrated the life they had built together in full bloom around them. Eleanor leaned into her husband's embrace, thinking of the young woman who had stood in the dust 20 years ago, watching her family reject her choice. "We made it," she whispered. "We did," Jackson agreed, his arms tightening around her. "Together." That night, after their guests had departed and their children had retired to their rooms, Eleanor stood before the mirror in their bedroom, studying her reflection. At 42, she was no longer the sheltered girl who had defied her family for love. Lines had formed at the corners of her eyes, evidence of both laughter and hardship. Her hands bore the marks of work, of creating something from nothing. Her body had carried and nourished 3 children. Jackson appeared behind her, meeting her eyes in the mirror's reflection. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders. "I'm thinking about that day," she replied, knowing he would understand which day she meant. "About how frightened I was, standing there with nothing but a valise and a broken heart," he nodded, remembering. "You didn't look frightened. You looked brave." Eleanor turned to face him, reaching up to trace the lines that years of sun and weather had etched into his beloved face. "I wasn't brave until you came back with those saddlebags, until you said we'll go. That's when I knew everything would be all right somehow." Jackson caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I was terrified," he admitted with a smile. "Riding back to town, packing what little I had, wondering how I was going to take care of Eleanor Evans, who'd never known a day of hardship." "And now," she asked, "now I know I never needed to worry." He drew her close. "You're the strongest person I've ever known, Ellie. You made a home out of nothing, won over a town that once scorned you, reconciled with a father who disowned you, all while raising our children to be as remarkable as you are." Eleanor rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady heartbeat that had been her comfort for 20 years. "We did all that together," she corrected gently, "every step of the way." That night, as they lay together in the darkness of the home they had built, Eleanor thought of all the paths their lives might have taken. If she had chosen differently that day, if she had bowed to her father's demands and let Jackson ride away without her, she might have had wealth and social position. She might have married a man her father approved of, lived a life of comfort and ease. But she would never have known this, the bone-deep contentment of a life authentically lived, of love freely chosen despite the cost. She would never have discovered her own strength, or the joy of building something meaningful alongside a partner who valued her for exactly who she was. No regrets. Jackson murmured, seeming to sense the direction of her thoughts. Eleanor smiled in the darkness, her hand finding his as it had thousands of times before. "Not one," she replied with absolute certainty. "Every hardship, every struggle, every tear, they were all worth it. Because they brought us here. Together," Jackson said, the word both a statement and a promise. "Together," Eleanor echoed, closing her eyes and letting sleep claim her, secure in the knowledge that the choice she had made 20 years ago to follow her heart despite the consequences had been the first step on the journey to her truest self, and to a happiness deeper and more enduring than she could ever have imagined. In the years that followed, as their children married and had families of their own, as their business interests expanded, and their reputation grew. Jackson and Eleanor Archer remained each other's truest companions. They weathered the turn of the century together, marveling at new inventions, adapting to changing times while holding fast to the values that had sustained them through their journey. And when visitors came to their home, admiring their prosperity and asking the secret to their success, Eleanor would simply smile and exchange a look with the man who had once packed a saddlebag and offered her the world. "We chose each other," she would say. "Everything else followed from that."